The federal government has rejected the Queensland government's calls to jointly fund a $741 million flood relief package. Key points. In a letter, the Prime Minister said it was the responsibility of state and local governments. In a letter, the Prime Minister said it was the responsibility of state and local governments. He has, however, agreed to a 50-50 split on a $30 million cleanup package. He has, however, agreed to a 50-50 split on a $30 million cleanup package. The state government says the move confirms Scott Morrison does not care about flood victims. Premier Annastacia Palaszczuk wrote to the Prime Minister last month, requesting the Commonwealth pay for half of the proposed funding package, which would give flood-affected Queenslanders the option to retrofit, raise up or voluntarily sell back homes at a high risk from future floods. Under the plan, grants of up to $50,000 would be made available to modify 5,500 flood-affected homes, while grants of up to $100,000 would be on offer to raise 1,000 homes. However, in a letter sent to the Premier this week, Prime Minister Scott Morrison said the additional programs proposed were the responsibility of state and local governments. These are important programs that, traditionally, fall within the responsibilities and discretion of local and state governments, and therefore, outside the scope of our DIFA, disaster recovery funding arrangements process, Mr. Morrison wrote. These programs can, and should, be directly funded and delivered by the Queensland Government, in the same way that the Commonwealth fully funds significant elements of our own contribution. The has knocked back a proposal to share funding for grants of up to $50,000 to retrofit 5,500 Queensland flood-affected homes, and grants of up to $100,000 to raise 1,000 homes. The federal government has agreed to a 50-50 split on a $30 million support package to help local governments and agencies with cleanup costs. In the letter, Mr. Morrison said the total Commonwealth funding contribution to the flood response in Queensland was $927 million, with more than $370 million already spent on immediate support for flood victims. Speaking in Parramatta today, Mr. Morrison reiterated that the proposed measures were not a federal government responsibility. What I know is we've already turned up, and we'll keep turning up with the things we're responsible for, Mr. Morrison said. The requests they've made, under these programs, go outside of the scope of what the normal arrangements are for flood responses. When state governments have spent as much as we have on supporting flood victims, then I think they can be critical. PM has made a political calculation, says Acting Premier. Queensland's Acting Premier Cameron Dick acknowledged the proposal was an exceptional circumstances application under the disaster recovery funding arrangements, but accused Mr. Morrison of having turned his back on Queenslanders in crisis. This is the highest level of disrespect for Queenslanders and the highest level of disrespect for our state from the Prime Minister, Mr. Dick said. On the eve of the election, he's announced that he will not be providing hope to Queensland families who have been smashed, time and again, by flooding and natural disasters in this state. Mr. Morrison has made the political calculation that he does not need the votes of flood-impacted families in this state. It is not a state government responsibility. This is a national responsibility. Queensland's Acting Premier Cameron Dick says the state has been disrespected by the federal government. Mr. Dick confirmed that Queensland would go it alone on a package without federal support, but said it would not go as far to help flood victims. We will not remove our money, Mr. Dick said. We will continue with the program. We'll have to reconsider what we can do, but it just won't go as far, and that's the real crying shame of this. We've really tried to do this in a positive, constructive fashion, because every piece of advice and research and evidence says you need to build back better, and that's precisely why we put this program together. But it seems it's a very clear no from the federal government, and we just don't think that's acceptable, he said. The federal government has, however, agreed to a 50-50 split on a $30 million support package to help local governments and not-for-profit agencies with cleanup costs. PM says politicization of disasters unfortunate. Mr. Morrison suggested the Queensland government was politicising the flood response. I think we've seen over some time now a real politicisation, and it's very unfortunate. A real politicisation of natural disasters, Mr. Morrison said. I don't think people, frankly, are that interested in the politicking between state governments having a crack at the federal government. In his letter to Ms. Palaszczuk, Mr. Morrison also extended an offer to Queensland for grant payments for flood-affected small businesses and not-for-profit organisations to be increased from $15,000 to $25,000. The Commonwealth recognises there's more that can be done to provide additional, upfront resources to small businesses and not-for-profit organisations, he wrote. I have authorised New South Wales raising the amount of recovery grant payments from $15,000 to $25,000 for small businesses and not-for-profit organisations in LGAs highly impacted. I ask Queensland Government officials to work with the National Recovery and Resilience Agency on administration of the programs and reporting requirements.